picture a piece of copper the size of your palm, thin as a fingernail, pulled from red Georgia clay in the summer of 1925. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new, unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. The metal is dark green now, crusted with age, but the shape on it is clear. A face, human or close to it. The eyes are two empty holes punched clean through. The mouth is a flat line that gives nothing away. Whoever pressed this image into copper did it by hand, hammering from the backside, coaxing a flat sheet into a face that seems to watch you no matter where you stand. The man holding it that day had no idea what he'd found. He only knew his shovel had struck something that did not belong to the dirt around it. That place was Etowah, a cluster of earthen mounds rising out of the river bottoms near Cartersville, Georgia. The tallest mound stands over 60 feet high, built by hand, one basket of soil at a time, centuries before any European ship touched this coast. Beneath that mound, and others like it, lay the dead of a people who ruled this river valley long before anyone wrote their name down. They buried their leaders with shell beads, with polished stone, and with copper faces, copper hands, copper birds with wings spread wide, cut and shaped from metal that had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this valley. Here is the strange part. Nobody living today knows what these faces mean. Not really. We can measure them. We can photograph them. We can trace the copper back to mines near Lake Superior, over 800 miles north, and marvel at how far that metal traveled on foot and by river before it ever reached a craftsman's hands in Georgia. But the moment you ask what the face on that copper sheet was meant to say, the room goes quiet. There is no letter, no carved sentence, no elder who sat down in 1925 and explained what the maker intended. The people who made these faces left no written word behind. What they left instead was metal, bent into the shape of something they needed you to remember. If you had stood in that excavation trench in 1925, you would have felt the weight of that silence before anyone said a word about it. The dig crew would have gone still. The only sound would have been red clay falling off a copper edge, soft as a whisper, and then nothing. You would have understood, without being told, that you were looking at a message with no sender left alive to claim it. This is the mystery that never made it into the school books, not because it isn't real, because it doesn't resolve. There is no name for the man buried in that mound, with a copper face laid across his chest. There is no treaty, no letter, no legend passed down mouth to mouth that tells us who he was to his people, or why his death demanded that a craftsman spend days, maybe weeks, hammering a human likeness out of northern copper. Historians call the people who built Etowah part of the Mississippian world, a wide and grand network of towns and mounds that stretched across the southeast. But that name is a modern label, stitched on from the outside. The people themselves had another name for who they were, and that name did not survive. Some believe the copper faces were meant for the living to look upon during ceremony, worn or carried, glinting under torchlight in a plaza full of drums. Others believe they were made only for the dead, sealed into darkness the moment the maker finished the last hammer strike, never meant for daylight again. Both theories rest on the same evidence, and both leave the same gap. Nobody can ask the artist what he intended. Nobody can ask the man in the mound what the face meant to him. That is where this story begins. Not with an answer, but with a face pulled out of red clay, its eyes two holes, letting the Georgia sunlight through for the first time in perhaps 600 years. Somewhere between that copper sheet and the hands that shaped it lies a whole civilization's way of speaking. We are still holding the words we have simply lost the language. Picture northwest Georgia in the early spring. The Etowah River moves slow and brown through a valley of red clay and pine fog, sits on the water at dawn like a wool blanket, thick enough to hide the far bank. The air smells of wet earth and rotting leaves, the kind of smell that gets into your coat and stays there. This is 1954. The town nearby calls itself Cartersville, a small place of brick storefronts and gravel roads. Where the courthouse clock is the only thing that hurries, men wear canvas work coats and felt hats. Women hang wash on lines, strung between porch posts at night. The streets go dim under a few electric bulbs, and past the edge of town, there is nothing but dark fields and the sound of insects. But if you walk south from the courthouse square, past the last house, past the last fence line, the ground starts to change under your boots. It rises. Not much, just enough to notice. 3 grass-covered mounds break the flat river bottom like the backs of sleeping animals. The tallest stands over 60 feet high, wider at the base than a city block. Farmers have plowed around these mounds for over 100 years. Nobody plowed through them. Nobody built on them either. You could stand at the base of the largest one, feel the sun on your neck, and still feel a chill you cannot explain. Local families have their own name for this ground. Some call it the Indian Mounds. Some just call it the Old Fields. Cattle graze near the base in warm months, and children dare each other to climb to the top, though most stop halfway, turn around, and walk back down without saying why. Nobody in town can tell you who built these hills of earth. Nobody can tell you what is inside them either. Not with any certainty, not in 1954. The river itself curls close to this ground, wrapping around the mounds on 3 sides like a moat somebody dug on purpose. Though nobody dug it, willow trees lean over the water, their branches trailing like fingers testing the current. In March, the water runs high and fast from spring rain, carrying broken branches and clumps of red clay downstream toward the Calusa. The land smells of new growth, honeysuckle not yet in bloom, mud drying slow under a pale sun. It is farm country, quiet country, the kind of place where a truck engine can be heard from a mile off. If you had stood on that riverbank in 1954, you would have felt how old the ground was under your feet, older than the fences, older than the roads, older than the town itself. Local memory keeps this place at arm's length, the way people keep quiet about a house where something bad happened, even if nobody remembers what. Old-timers say their grandparents avoided walking on the mounds after dark. Some say cattle would not graze on the tallest one, no matter how good the grass looked. These are the kinds of stories that get passed at dinner tables and front porches, never written down, never taken too seriously by the people telling them, and never quite forgotten either. By the 1950s, the state of Georgia has already started paying attention to this ground. A few small digs happened here decades earlier, careful ones, curious ones, turning up broken pottery and scraps of shell. But nothing had cracked this place open. Nothing had forced the town to reckon with what sat beneath their pastures. The mounds kept their secrets, the way the river kept its current, moving quiet and steady, giving nothing away on the surface. This is the kind of town where secrets do not need locked doors. They just need distance and time, and a river that keeps everybody's eyes pointed toward the water instead of the ground. Cartersville minded its own business. It always had. The dirt roads leading out to the mounds saw more mule carts than automobiles well into that decade, and the people who lived closest to that ground had made peace with not knowing. You would have felt that peace too if you had lived there. Not fear, exactly, Something closer to respect, the kind you give an old house you were told never to enter. Even after the family that built it is gone, nobody in that town in 1954 could have told you that within a few years the ground beneath those grass mounds would open up and hand back faces, copper faces, hammered thin as a coin, staring up out of red clay, with eyes that had no pupils and mouths that said nothing at all. The river kept moving. The fog kept rising every morning, the same as it always had. But the silence over that valley was about to end, at least for a little while. And what came up out of the earth would ask a question that nobody living could answer. The man who started it all had a name most folks in Bartow County forgot to write down, but the old-timers who talked about it later called him John. Just John. A farmer with a mule, a plow, and a field he had turned 100 times before without trouble. That spring the ground fought back. His plow caught on something hard, something that would not give. He figured it was a buried stump, maybe a stone the size of a washtub. He backed his mule up, tried again from another angle, and the blade snapped clean at the joint. Wood does not break like that, unless it hits something older than wood has any right to hit. Picture him standing there in the dirt, sweat cutting lines down a sunburned neck, staring at a broken plow in the middle of a field he thought he knew by heart. The mule shifts its weight and snorts. A crow calls somewhere past the tree line. John kneels down, brushes red clay away with the side of his hand, and feels something smooth where there should have been only rock and root. He was not a scholar. He was not looking for anything but a clean furrow and a good yield come harvest. That matters, because the people who find these things are almost never the people looking for them. History has a habit of showing up uninvited in the middle of an ordinary call to a man who just wants his supper. Word traveled the way it always did in a small river town. Slow at first, then all at once, a neighbor came to help pull the broken plow free, and saw the shape of the mound rising behind John's field, higher than he remembered, shouldered up against the sky like something waiting to be noticed. By the next planting season, men from Cartersville were walking that field with shovels instead of seed bags. Among them came a man named Warren Moorhead, though the locals mostly just called him the professor from up north. He wore a coat too heavy for Georgia heat and carried a leather satchel that never left his shoulder. He moved slow across that ground, the way a man moves through a church he does not belong to but respects all the same. He crouched at the base of the mound and ran his palm across the soil, feeling for something the eye could not find. Moorhead had already spent years walking mounds across the Midwest, cataloguing what other farmers' plows had turned up before John's ever did. He carried notebooks thick with sketches and a habit of talking to himself while he worked, muttering measurements under his breath, like a man saying a rosary. The workers who dug alongside him were local men, farmhands mostly, paid by the day, unsure at first what all the fuss was about. They swung their shovels the same way they always had, until the dirt gave up something that made every one of them go quiet. You would have felt that same hush settle over you, standing at the edge of that trench, watching grown men stop mid-swing because the ground had just answered a question nobody thought to ask out loud. There was also a boy, one of the local hires, no older than 16, who kept coming back to the site even after his shift ended. He would sit on the mound slope in the evening light, watching the shadows stretch long across the disturbed earth, as if the place had a pull on him that work alone could not explain. Nobody wrote his name down either. He is a ghost in the record, same as John, same as most of the hands that did the actual digging, while history remembers only the man with the notebook. These were not treasure hunters. They were not men chasing gold or glory. They were farmers, laborers, and one traveling scholar with cold coffee in a tin cup, and dirt permanently pressed into the creases of his knuckles. They worked slow, careful, because even without knowing what lay beneath them, something about that mound demanded it. The Georgia sun sat low and orange over the tree line, most evenings by the time they stopped for the day, throwing long shadows across the trench walls, turning the red clay the color of a dying ember. Moorhead would close his notebook, tuck it under his arm, and walk the perimeter one more time before dark, as if checking that the mound was still there, still willing to keep talking. Nobody on that field in those first weeks had any idea what they were circling. They only knew the ground was not empty, and it had not been empty for a very long time. What came up out of that clay would change how they saw the mound, the valley, and the people who built it centuries before any of them were born. Picture the man for a moment. His name has faded from most accounts, the way names do when nobody thinks to write them down in time. What survives is the shape of his days, and that shape was simple, worn smooth by repeating itself 1,000 times over. He rose before the sun most mornings. The house was cool then, the fire banked low, and his wife would already be moving in the kitchen, the smell of cornbread and coffee thick in the air. He pulled on boots stiff with yesterday's mud outside. The fields lay quiet and grey, waiting for the plow the way they waited every spring, patient as an old dog by the door. You would have known this kind of morning if you had lived it. The cold bite of the air on your face, the mule's breath rising like smoke in front of you, the world not yet decided whether it wanted to be bright or stay dim, hanging there between the two. The mounds themselves were just part of the property. They rose up out of the bottom land like slow green waves, humped and grassy, some of them taller than a barn. Nobody in that stretch of the valley thought much about them. Children rolled down their sides in summer. Cattle grazed across their flanks without a second thought. Folks called them the Indian Hills, the way you might call a creek the Indian Creek, a name worn into the land without much weight behind it anymore. The farmer plowed close to the base of the largest mound, because the soil there ran dark and rich, black as poured coffee, good for corn. He had done this every planting season for years. The mule leaned into the harness. The blade cut long straight lines through earth that had likely never once been broken since the mound was raised over it, centuries before his grandfather's grandfather ever crossed an ocean to get here. That day, the plow caught on something it should not have caught on, not a root, not a stone, something with an edge too straight, too deliberate to be anything the ground had made on its own. The mule stopped. The farmer stopped with it, the way a man does when his body understands something is different before his mind has caught up. He knelt down in the furrow, his hands, cracked and brown from a life outdoors, pushed into the cool clay. And there, half wrapped in dark earth, the color of strong tea, something gave back a dull gleam that dirt has no business giving. This is the part of the story worth sitting with, because before this moment, his life had a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Wake, work, eat, sleep, and start again. The valley moved at the pace of seasons, not surprises. Rivers rose and fell the way they always had. Crops came up green in April and gold by August. Nothing in that quiet, sunlit world had prepared him for clay that glinted like it remembered fire. He probably thought it was nothing much at first, a bit of scrap, maybe, or some old cattle piece, long since buried and forgotten. Farmers turned up all kinds of things in that soil, arrowheads and broken pottery, bits of flint worn smooth by centuries of water. None of it ever amounted to much. None of it ever asked to be looked at twice. But this piece did not look like flint. It did not look like anything he had pulled from a furrow before. The metal held its shape, even bent, even buried, the way copper does when it has been worked slow and careful by a human hand rather than shaped by chance. If you had knelt beside him in that furrow, the smell of turned earth thick around you, you would have felt the same small hush settle over the morning. Birds still called from the tree line. The mule still shifted its weight and switched its tail against flies. But something in you would have gone still, the way a held breath goes still, because your hands had just closed around a question with no one left alive to answer it. He did not know yet what he was holding. He only knew it did not belong to the plow or the field or any century he understood. He set it on the ground beside him, brushed the clay from his palms, and looked up at the mound rising green and silent above the tree line, patient as it had been for 1,000 years, giving nothing else away. The morning went on being ordinary around him. The sun climbed a little higher. The mule waited. Somewhere behind him, smoke still curled soft from his own chimney. Breakfast still warm on the table, but the valley had shifted, quiet as a held breath, and nothing about that field would ever again feel quite as simple as it had an hour before. The farmer's shovel hit something that was not stone. It was a different sound, flat, almost hollow, like a knuckle knocking on a closed door. He knelt in the red clay and brushed away the dirt with his fingers. The dirt was cool and damp, the way dirt gets deep under a mound that the sun never touches. And there, looking up at him, was a face, not a skull, not a bone, a face made of copper, thin as a coin, hammered into a shape no living person in that county had ever seen. The eyes were empty ovals. The mouth was a straight, calm line. Around the head ran a design of feathers and circles, pressed into the metal by hands that had worked it while it was warm, or cold, or soft. Nobody could say for certain. The farmer did not move for a long moment. He just knelt there, holding dirt in one hand and centuries in the other. If you had been the one kneeling in that clay, you would have felt the same thing he felt. Not fear exactly, something closer to the feeling of walking into a room where a conversation just stopped. You would have looked at that face and known, somehow, that it was looking back. Word spread through the town the way it always does in a small place. Not fast, but complete. By supper, 3 families knew. By the next morning, the whole county did. Men came out to the field with their own shovels, their own questions, their own theories, already forming before the ground had even finished, giving up what it was holding. Some said Spanish gold. Some said pirate treasure buried inland by men running from the coast. Nobody said what it turned out to be, because nobody yet had the words for it. The mound gave up more than one face that week. There were several, each a little different, each hammered from sheets of copper, so thin you could almost see light through them if you held them right. Some showed a man's head with a woodpecker's beak curving down over the brow, the eye of the bird set where a human eye should be. Others showed antlers rising off a human skull like branches of a winter tree. One face wore a headdress of what looked like woven cord, or maybe feathers, or maybe something with no name left in any language spoken in that valley. The men who dug did not know what they were looking at. They only knew it did not match anything they had learned as children, and it did not match anything their grandfathers had described either. This was not a story passed down. This was a story that had never been told at all, at least not to them, at least not in a way that survived. A stranger showed up on the third day. Nobody in town remembered his name later, or claimed not to. He walked the field slowly, hands behind his back, looking at the copper laid out on a wagon bed like it was a body waiting for a preacher. He said one thing that stuck with the men who heard it, repeated it to their wives that night, and their wives repeated it to the neighbors. He said, "These are not decorations, these are letters." And then he walked back to wherever he had come from, and nobody saw him again. Nobody understood what he meant. Letters to whom? Written by whom? In what language? And using what alphabet? When there was no alphabet anyone could find. But the phrase sat in that town like a stone in a shoe. Letters, as if the copper faces were trying to say something, and had been trying to say it for 400 years or more, and every person who touched them was simply too late to hear it. You can still feel that same confusion today if you stand in front of one of these faces in a glass case. The metal does not explain itself. It never did, and it never will. Not to the men who dug it up, and not to you standing in a quiet museum hall 100 years later. The hollow eyes ask nothing and answer nothing. They simply exist, the way a locked door exists, patient and closed, whether or not anyone still remembers where the key went. The farmer kept digging that week, and the town kept talking, and neither one of them yet understood the size of what had opened under that Georgia field. They thought they had found buried treasure. What they had actually found was a voice with no mouth left to speak it, pressed into metal by people whose names had already slipped out of memory before the first shovel ever touched the mound. Word spread through Cartersville the way smoke moves through a barn, slow at first, then all at once, filling every corner before anyone could name where it started. By the second week, the men at the feed store had a theory. By the third, the women at church had a different one. Nobody agreed on much, but everybody agreed the copper faces were not right, for something pulled out of red Georgia clay. You would have noticed it too if you had held one. The metal came out of the ground, bright, not dulled, not crusted green like old pennies left in a jar, bright, like it had been polished the week before and buried out of spite. Old farmer named Coot Pruitt, who had turned soil his whole life and buried plenty of things by accident, said he had never seen copper do that. Copper turns, he told anyone who would listen at the general store counter. Coins turn, wire turns, everything turns, given enough dirt and enough years. This didn't. The dig crew felt it too, though most of them wouldn't say so outright. One young laborer, a boy no older than 19, told his mother he'd touched one of the plates before the foreman stopped him. He said it was warm, not sun warm, not hand warm from somebody else's grip. Warm on its own, like it had a low fire lit somewhere inside the metal that never quite went out. His mother told the story at church the following Sunday, and by Monday, half the county had heard some version of it, each one a little different, each one a little bigger. The old-timers had their own memories to trade, and trading is what they did, sitting on porches with coffee going cold in their hands. One woman, Miss Adeline Ford, who was near 80 and had outlived 2 husbands and a house fire, remembered her grandfather talking about the metal men in the hill. She said he'd grown up 2 counties over and told a story passed to him by his own grandfather about faces buried under a mound that watched the river and never blinked, never rusted, never let anybody forget they were there. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought to. It was just a thing old men said on porches, the way people talk about weather that already passed. At the tavern, the talk ran rougher, A man who'd worked the rail lines swore he'd heard of copper turning up before, further west, in a mound some farmer ploughed into back before the war. He said the men who found it got sick, one after another, and the ones who didn't get sick swore off digging altogether. Nobody could say if it was true. Nobody could say it wasn't. That is the shape folklore takes when it has no paper to rest on. It survives by being repeated, not proven, and every mouth that carries it adds a little weight of its own. The preacher had his own view, gentler than the rest, but no less strange in its own quiet way. He stood on the church steps one Sunday and told his congregation the copper had not tarnished because it had never belonged to ordinary men. Ordinary things rust, ordinary things fall apart in the ground, like anything else does, wood and bone and cloth alike. What does not fall apart, he said, was made for something bigger than a grave. He did not say what. He let the silence do the rest of the work, and the congregation carried that silence home with them, turning it over in their heads the way you turn a stone in your pocket. If you had walked the streets of that town in those weeks, you would have felt it in the air itself, a kind of hush laid over ordinary talk. Grocers spoke lower. Children were told to stay clear of the sight out past the river bend. Even the dogs, some said, would not go near the mounds after dark, circling wide and whining low, though nobody could say if that was memory of the disturbance or something older than the digging itself. Nobody in Cartersville claimed to understand the copper. They only claimed to have felt something around it, a weight in the air, a warmth in the metal, a hush that settled over the fields at dusk. Every story added a piece, a rumor, a half-remembered word from a grandfather long dead. None of them added up to an answer. They only added up to a feeling, passed hand to hand, like the copper itself, bright and untouched by time, waiting for someone to explain what it was never going to explain on its own. Long before the plow struck copper in that Georgia clay, the mound at Etowah was already old. Older than the town around it, older than the state that claimed it. By the time European boots ever touched that riverbank, the people who built the mound were already gone, and the ground had already started to forget them. Picture the mound as it once stood, 600 years before any settler drew a map of the Etowah River. It rose taller then, packed layer by layer with basket loads of earth, carried on human backs, thousands of trips, thousands of hands. A city spread around its base, with plazas swept clean and homes built in neat rows, and smoke rising soft over thatched roofs in the cool of morning. This was not a scattered camp. This was a capital. Historians call the people who lived there part of the Mississippian world, a wide network of towns and chiefdoms that stretched across the southeast and up the great river valleys. Etowah stood among the largest of them, its chiefs ruled by a mix of bloodline and belief, the kind of authority that comes wrapped in ceremony and sky. But here is the trouble. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the name of a single chief who ruled there. History remembers the mound. It never learned the name of the people who raised it. You can feel the strangeness of that if you sit with it. A society, organized enough to move a mountain of dirt by hand, skilled enough to hammer raw copper into human faces thin as parchment. And yet it left behind no word for us to read, no name carved anywhere that says who they were. It is like finding a beautiful house with the porch light still on, and no one able to tell you who lived there. Some experts believe the silence comes from something practical rather than mysterious. Southeastern nations of the time kept their history in memory and voice, not in written script. Names were spoken, not carved into stone. When the last speakers of that memory died, or moved on, or simply stopped repeating the old names to new children, the words went with them. No malice, no secret, just the ordinary erosion of oral memory over centuries. Other researchers push back on that idea. They point out that the Mississippian world did leave marks, symbols pressed into pottery, etched into shell, hammered into copper. A visual language, if not a written one. If they left symbols, the argument goes, why not names? Why would a people so devoted to image and ceremony leave every face anonymous? That question has no settled answer, and it likely never will. What the mound does tell us, in its layers, is a story of change. Etowah was built, abandoned, and rebuilt more than once. Archaeologists find gaps in the soil, stretches of time where the town emptied out, followed by new construction laid right over the old. Something scattered these people more than once. Drought, maybe. War with a neighboring chiefdom, maybe. Even, that is argued over, town by town, layer by layer, with no side able to close the case for good. By the time explorers from Spain pushed through the southeast in the 1500s, the great chiefdom at Etowah had already gone quiet. The mound stood there like a monument, with the plaque missing, tall and unmistakable, but already a memory even to the people living nearby. Later nations in the region, the Muskogee among them, carried stories of mound-building ancestors, though even those stories drift and vary from town to town, family to family. The line back to Etowah's builders had already thinned by then, like a river splitting into smaller and smaller streams, until you can no longer say for certain which one is the original channel. If you had stood on that mound the day it was truly abandoned, you would have felt no drama in it. No fire, no final battle most likely, just fewer footsteps each season, fewer fires lit at dusk, the plaza growing quiet, then grown over, until the forest simply took back what people had cleared. That kind of ending rarely gets written down anywhere, because there is no one left standing to write it. So, when that plow hit copper in the 19th century, it did not just strike an old object. It struck the buried edge of a world that had already lost its own name, centuries before any settler arrived to lose it a second time. The chiefdom had no name left to speak. The copper faces, it turns out, may be the closest thing to a voice these people have left at all. By the 1880s, the mounds at Etowah had drawn more than farmers with broken plows. They drew men with notebooks and calipers, men who called themselves scientists, sent by places like the Smithsonian to make sense of what lay under Georgia clay. One of them was John P. Rogan, a careful man who kept records the way a banker keeps ledgers. He came in 1883 with shovels and patience, and he started digging into the largest mound on the property, the one the locals just called Mound C. You can picture him there in the heat, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening his collar, watching dirt fall away one layer at a time. Rogan was not looking for treasure. He was looking for order, for some pattern that would let him write a report that made sense back in Washington. What he found, instead, was a room built for the dead, packed tighter with wonder than any report could hold. Bodies lay in rows, some stretched flat, some sitting upright, surrounded by shell beads, stone tools, and sheets of hammered copper folded like cloth. He wrote it all down. He measured the burials, sketched the layout, numbered every object as if numbers could explain what he was looking at. But numbers could not tell him who these people had been, or why they buried their dead, with the faces of gods pressed into metal. Rogan's notebooks are still in the archives today, careful and thorough, and utterly silent on the one question that mattered most. Who made these things, and why did they stop? That silence did not sit well with everyone. A few decades later, in the 1920s, a new wave of diggers came through, better funded, using tools Rogan never had. They found more copper, more shell, more burials layered on top of older burials, like the mound had been used again and again across centuries. Each new excavation added facts and subtracted certainty in equal measure. The more they learned about how the site was built, the less they understood about why it was abandoned. If you had stood at the edge of that trench in the 1920s, you would have felt the strange weight of finding too much and too little at the same time. The evidence piled up in wooden crates, shipped off to museums in Washington and Atlanta, catalogued under case numbers instead of names. Nobody wrote down what the objects meant to the people who made them, because nobody left alive could say. The chiefdom had gone silent generations before the first shovel ever touched the ground. Some investigators tried to bridge that gap, using the Cherokee and Creek nations who lived in the region by the time European settlers arrived. Elders and historians from those communities were sometimes consulted, and their memories held pieces of ritual, pieces of belief, fragments about ancestors and sacred fire. But even they were careful to say the people of Etowah were not their direct forebears in any simple sense. Time and displacement had scattered too much. What they offered were echoes, not translations, more like hearing a song through a thick wall than reading a letter. That has left a strange kind of investigation, one built more on guesswork and comparison than confession. Scholars line up the copper faces from Etowah beside similar plates found in Oklahoma and Illinois, looking for shared patterns the way you might compare handwriting on old letters. They find enough overlap to believe these societies spoke to each other somehow, traded ideas and images across hundreds of miles, but they cannot prove a single word of what any of it meant, because the makers left behind pictures, never captions. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person doing this work, a quiet that comes from proving a mystery is real without ever getting to solve it. Rogan felt it in his sunburned, careful notes. The excavators in the 1920s felt it standing over crates they could not fully explain. Every archaeologist who has picked up a copper face since has felt some version of that same hush, the sense of holding a message with no address and no sender. If you had opened one of Rogan's field journals in a quiet reading room, the ink faded to brown, you would have felt that same hollow patience settle into your own hands. He wrote pages of measurements and drew maps with careful lines. He never wrote the word mystery, but the shape of it sits between every line he left. The silence he ran into was not empty. It was the sound of a whole people who once spoke, now with nobody left to answer. The digging at Etowah did not stay locked in old field moats. It lived on in the mouths of people who stood at the edge of that mound and felt something shift under their boots. You would think an archaeological site fades into paperwork. This one did not. It kept finding its way into private conversations, decades apart, from people who had never met. A woman named Ruth Calloway worked as a volunteer at the Etowah Site Museum back in the 1960s. She dusted display cases for years before anyone let her near the real collection. She used to tell visitors, in a voice barely above a whisper, that the copper faces made her cold every single time she opened their case. Not a chill from the air conditioning, a cold that came from somewhere else, she said, like standing in a doorway with wind blowing through it. She never said the word haunted. She said the faces were watching the room, waiting for someone to walk in who understood them. A retired soil surveyor named Dale Whitfield spent one whole summer mapping the Mounds interior with ground-penetrating radar. He told a local historian, years after the fact, that his equipment kept returning readings that made no sense, dense metal signatures clustered in patterns too even to be random, he said, like rows of seated men waiting for a meeting that never started. He ran the scan 3 times to be sure. Every time the shapes held their position, He never published the data. He said nobody would believe a man who mapped ghosts with a machine built to find pipes. Then there is the account of Reverend Everett Sims, who grew up 2 miles from the Mounds in the 1940s. As a boy, he used to walk past the site on his way to school, and he swore the ground there felt different under his feet. Softer, he said, like walking on something that remembered being alive. He did not think of it as scary. He thought of it the way you think of a quiet room in a house where someone used to sleep. You lower your voice without deciding to. You walk a little slower. He carried that feeling with him his whole life, long after he left the county. If you had walked that same path as a child, you might have felt it too, without knowing why your footsteps slowed. A young archaeology student named Priya Anand worked 1 field season at Etowah in the early 2000s. She was cataloging broken shell beads, nothing dramatic, but she told her supervisor she kept dreaming about the copper faces at night, dreams where the faces turned toward her and opened their mouths, though they made no sound. She was not a superstitious person. She had a lab background, chemistry courses, the whole practical mind of a scientist. She said, the dreams stopped the day she left the site and never came back after, no matter how many other digs she worked. None of these people knew each other. None of them read each other's stories before telling their own. And yet, the details line up in a way that is hard to shake off. A cold that has no source, a shape that repeats itself under the ground, a softness in the earth that feels like memory, a face that turns without turning. Separately, each account sounds like a private feeling, easy to dismiss. Together, they start to sound like a pattern. Some folks in town say these mounds sit over more than bodies. They say the dead who were buried there were never meant to rest quietly, that whatever ceremony placed those copper faces in the ground was left unfinished when the chiefdom itself went silent. Others push back hard against that idea. They say grief does strange things to memory, that a mound built for the dead will always feel heavy to the living standing on top of it. Copper or no copper, cold ground is just cold ground, they say. A dream is just a dream. But nobody who worked that site for long stayed unaffected by it. That much every account agrees on. Whether you believe in cold spots or soft earth or faces that turn in dreams, the mound left its mark on the people who spent real time near it. Something about standing that close to the unanswered pulls at a person. It did then. It still does now, if you walk those grounds today and let yourself go quiet long enough to listen. Look close at one copper face from Etowah, and then look at another one found 300 miles away in Spiro, Oklahoma. You will see the same eye, the same open hand pressed flat against a chest, the same feathered headdress bent at the same odd angle. Nobody taught these 2 artists to draw that way at the same time. Nobody wrote a book and mailed it down the river, and yet the hands match, like 2 people copying the same picture in a dark room they never shared. This is where the pattern starts to show its shape. A falcon dancer at Etowah bends his knees the exact way a falcon dancer bends his knees on a shell cup from Spiro. A weeping eye motif, a small tear etched below the socket, shows up on copper from Georgia, and on pottery from Arkansas, and on stone from Tennessee. The distances between these places would have taken weeks to walk. There were no roads then, of the kind we know. There were only rivers, forests thick with fog, and feet. If you had stood on the banks of the Etowah River in the year 1250, you would have felt the weight of a world stitched together by something other than words. Canoes moved along that water, carrying more than corn and hides. They carried pictures. They carried a way of seeing gods and ancestors that spread from Florida up through the Mississippi Valley and out toward Oklahoma, the same way a song moves through a crowd before anyone remembers who started singing it. Historians have a name for this now. They call it the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a dry academic term for something that feels, when you hold the copper in your hand, more like a shared dream. Some researchers believe this was a religion, a whole system of belief about death, the sky, and the underworld, carried by priests who traveled between chiefdoms the way traveling preachers once moved through the American frontier. Under this theory, the falcon dancer is not just a costume. He is a role, maybe a title, passed down and performed in different towns using the same sacred script. The copper face you are looking at might once have hung from the neck of a man who held real power, a man whose job was to stand between his people and the world of spirits. Other researchers push back on that idea. They argue this was not religion in the way we use the word. It might have been closer to a trade language, a shared set of images that let different peoples recognize rank and alliance without speaking a common tongue. A weeping eye might have meant war in one town and mourning in another. A falcon might have marked a chief in Georgia and a warrior society in Oklahoma. Under this view, the copper faces are less like scripture and more like a flag, a symbol everyone understood the shape of, even if they argued about the meaning. Both theories agree on one hard truth: nobody wrote any of it down. There is no scroll buried beside the copper that explains the falcon or the weeping eye. There is no elder's voice recorded on wax cylinder saying, "This is what my grandfather told me it meant." The chiefdoms of the Mississippian world left behind mounds, shell, copper, and stone. But they left no key. You are left holding a sentence in a language where every dictionary burned centuries before anyone thought to write one. And still, the pattern keeps rhyming. Archaeologists digging at different sites, in different decades, unaware of each other's work, kept finding the same figures bent the same way. A researcher in the 1930s at Etowah sketches a dancer with an open hand raised to the sky. A researcher in the 1960s at Spiro sketches almost the exact same pose, decades before the two teams ever compared notes. When they finally did compare notes, the resemblance felt less like an accident and more like an inheritance. You could call it a coincidence if it happened once. It did not happen once. It happened again and again in mounds hundreds of miles apart, made by people who might never have met, using a copper that traveled from a single source far to the north. The shape keeps repeating because someone somewhere taught it to repeat. The only silence left is the one that swallowed their reasons whole. Picture the copper before it was a face. Picture it as raw stone pulled from the earth near Lake Superior, over 1,000 miles north of Etowah. That copper came out of the ground, already soft, already pure. No smelting needed, no furnace required. A person could take a rock, a piece of native copper, and simply beat it into shape with patience and a steady hand. That is the first wonder of this story. The metal traveled farther than most people walked in a lifetime. Someone carried it, or traded it, or passed it hand to hand down a chain of rivers and footpaths that no map from that time has ever survived. By the time it reached the mound builders of the Etowah River, it had already crossed forests, crossed mountains, crossed the turning of many seasons. You are looking, when you look at this copper, at proof that people who never left a single written word still moved across half a continent with purpose. Now picture the hands that shaped it. The maker did not pour the copper into a mold. There was no casting, no melting down and reforming. The craftsman worked the metal cold, hammering it thin, patient stroke after patient stroke, the way a person might fold cloth 100 times to make it strong. This is called repousse, though the maker never used that word. The metal was placed over a carved wooden form, and the artist pushed the design out from behind, coaxing a face forward from the flat sheet, the way a sculptor might coax a shape from clay. Except here, there was no room for mistake. One hard strike in the wrong place could split the metal and undo weeks of work. The plates that survived show falcon-eyed men. Their eyes are marked with a forked design, a shape some call the weeping eye, though no one living can tell you what it meant to weep like that, or why the falcon was chosen, or what the bird carried for these people that made it worth wearing across your own face for eternity. The figures stand straight, shoulders set, headdresses raised. Some hold objects in their hands that might be maces, might be symbols of rank, might be something with no modern name at all. They do not smile. They do not seem to ask for anything. They simply stand, hammered into permanence, waiting for someone who will never come to explain them. Think of the moment these plates were laid into the earth. A person had died, someone of great importance, someone the whole town had gathered to bury. The copper faces were placed near the body, sometimes over the chest, sometimes near the head, as if they belonged to the dead the way a name belongs to a person. Then the dirt closed over all of it. The digging stopped. The mound grew quiet. For 700 years, maybe longer, nothing touched that copper except time itself. Copper does something no other common metal does. It resists the slow rot that eats through iron and turns it to rust and dust. It holds itself together in the dark, patient as stone, waiting the way only metal can wait. When the plates finally came back into the light, in the digging of the 1920s and 30s, the falcon eyes were still sharp. The forked lines around them were still crisp enough to trace with a fingertip. If you had lifted one from the dirt yourself, the weight of it would have surprised you, heavier than paper-thin metal should feel, warm from the sun within a few minutes, despite centuries in the cold ground. Some believe these faces were meant only for the dead, made specifically as grave goods, crafted once and buried once, never meant for daily wear. Others argue the wear patterns on certain pieces, small creases, small folds near the edges, suggest they were worn in life first, perhaps by chiefs or priests during ceremony, and only given to the earth after their owner's final breath. Both ideas remain theories. No burial record exists to confirm either one. No maker signed their work, and no witness left a diary describing the ceremony where these faces were first raised into torchlight. What is certain is smaller and stranger than any theory. Someone shaped this metal with nothing but patience, memory, and belief. They repeated the same eye, the same posture, the same bird across many separate towns, separate mounds, separate rivers, as if everyone agreed on the shape of something sacred, without ever writing the agreement down. If you held that face in your palm today, you would be holding the closest thing to a sentence this people ever left behind, and still, you would have no way to read it. Here is the part of the story that nobody likes to repeat, but it belongs here, so let's tell it slow. In the early 1900s, long after the Mounds at Etowah had given up their first faces, a man in North Georgia came into possession of one. Nobody remembers his name for certain now. Some say he was a relic hunter. Some say he was just a farmer who traded a mule for it. What every version agrees on is simpler and stranger. He melted it down. Picture that for a moment a sheet of copper, thin as a playing card, hammered by hands lost to time into the shape of a face, with wide hollow eyes and a headdress of feathers and beads, a face that had waited in the dark for maybe 600 years, and a man with a fire and a ladle, looking at it the way you might look at a piece of scrap you found in a ditch. The story goes that he wanted the metal. Copper was worth something, and old copper was still copper. He did not see a message. He did not see a language. He saw raw material, and raw material gets used, so he set it in the coals, and he watched a human face soften and slump and lose its shape, the way wax loses its shape near a candle's flame. You have to sit with that a while, because it does something strange to the chest. Think about every other object in this story. The plow that clipped the edge of a mound and stopped. The men who lowered themselves into the dark with lanterns and found faces looking back at them. Even the ones who took artifacts home to sell. Most of them kept the copper whole. They understood, in some rough way, that they had found something rare. But this man did not stop to wonder. He turned 6 centuries of hammer strokes into a puddle of liquid metal, and when it cooled, he had a lump of copper worth maybe a few dollars. Nobody knows how many faces met that same end. That is the part that sits heaviest. For every copper face resting now behind glass in a museum case, there may have been others that went into a forge instead of a display cabinet, melted for wire, melted for pots, melted because a man needed money more than he needed history, and history had not yet convinced anyone it deserved to survive. Some old-timers in the river towns near Etowah tell it a little different. In their version, the copper would not melt clean. They say the fire took strange colors, greens and blues, that copper should not throw off, and the metal fought the flame longer than metal should. They say the man who did it never spoke of it again, and something in him changed after that day, though nobody could say what. You can take that part as folklore, stacked on folklore, a story growing a second story, the way moss grows on stone. Or you can wonder if a face like that, made by hands with intention behind every strike, holds something in its shape that resists the fire meant to erase it. Here is the theory some collectors lean on. They say the melting proves the copper was never sacred to begin with, not in any way that outlived the people who made it. If it had carried real power, they argue, it would have been protected, hidden, passed down in secret the way some tribal objects were. Instead, it sat in a dirt floor for centuries and ended up in the hands of a man with a fire and no reason to hesitate. Objects that matter get remembered. This one nearly got erased, and almost was, but archaeologists who have spent years with the surviving faces push back hard against that reading. They point out that plenty of sacred things get lost simply because the people who understood them are gone, not because the things themselves were empty. A church bell, melted for cannon fire during a war, was not meaningless before the war took it. The silence around these faces, they argue, is not proof of small importance. It is proof that an entire world capable of explaining them collapsed, and what was left behind had no one to defend it. If you had stood in that farmyard and watched the metal go soft in the coals, you might not have felt anything unusual at all. It would have looked like scrap going into a fire, nothing more. That is the quiet horror hiding under this whole mystery. The line between an artifact and garbage is only ever the story someone tells about it, and for a long stretch of years, almost nobody was telling this one. We do not know how many faces we lost that way. We only know the ones that survived, waiting in the dark, are the only ones left to ask. Not every scholar who studied these faces believed there was a mystery at all. Some looked at the copper plates, and saw a simple thing. A chiefdom made art, the chiefdom fell, and the art outlived the people who made it. That is the plain version. It happens all over the world, in every century. No signature, no scroll, no secret, just time, doing what time always does to the things we leave behind. The skeptics have a point worth sitting with. Writing systems are rare in human history. Most cultures never had one, and most cultures did just fine without it. A society can build cities, raise armies, trade across 1,000 miles, and never once write a word down. Why should Etowah be any different? Maybe the silence around these faces is not a mystery. Maybe it is just what history sounds like before somebody with a pen shows up to write it down for you. There is a name that comes up when people talk about the skeptics, and it belongs to a Cherokee elder who worked with researchers in the 1930s. He listened to their questions about the copper faces. He looked at the photographs they brought him, the wide eyes, the strange headdresses, the forked lines running down the cheeks like tears made of lightning, and he told them plainly that he did not know what the symbols meant. He said his people had stories about the Mounds, but not about these specific faces, not this specific chiefdom. He would not guess, he would not invent an answer, just to give the researchers something to write in their notebook. You can hear that refusal as honesty, and you should. He had every reason to protect what he did not fully know. Elders across the southeast, again and again, gave the same kind of answer. They spoke of ancestors, of respect owed to the dead, of stories that belonged to certain families and no one else. They did not hand over neat explanations because neat explanations were not theirs to give. That silence was not evidence of nothing. It was evidence of care. Some anthropologists took that silence and ran further with their doubt. They argued the whole idea of a lost written language was romantic thinking, dressed up to sound mysterious. Better, they said, to call the copper faces what they most likely were: ceremonial objects, grave goods, symbols of rank, not sentences. A chief buried with his copper mask, the way a king might be buried with his crown. No lost alphabet required, just power dressed in metal, the way power has always liked to dress itself. That argument holds up fine, right up until you lay the faces side by side, because the same forked eye motif shows up on plates from Mississippi. The same weeping symbol turns up on a shell cup from Oklahoma, carved 400 miles from Etowah. A woodpecker figure, wings spread the same exact way, shows up in Georgia and in Tennessee both. If these were just decorations, just personal choices by individual craftsmen working alone in their own villages, you would expect them to look different from place to place. They do not, they repeat. They repeat like a word repeats when you hear it spoken twice. That is the gap the skeptics cannot quite close. A shared symbol used by isolated villages who never wrote anything down and never explained anything to each other is still, somehow, a shared symbol. Something carried it between them. A trader, a priest, a story passed hand to hand across a river system that had no roads and no maps and no need for either. If it was not writing, it was something standing very close to writing, a picture that meant the same thing to 100 different people who never met. Picture yourself holding one of those plates under a bare bulb in a storage room, turning it slowly so the light catches the hammer marks left by a hand 700 years gone. You would feel the pull of two arguments at once. One voice tells you this is simply metal, shaped by a person doing their job, nothing more. Another voice tells you the shape in your palm has cousins scattered across 5 states, all speaking the same visual sentence, and nobody alive can read a single word of it. Both voices are telling the truth, That is the strange part. The skeptics are right that there is no proof of an alphabet, no Rosetta Stone waiting in a mound somewhere, and the believers are right that something was being said over and over across hundreds of miles in a language built entirely of copper and posture and eye. The elders who refused to translate were not hiding an answer. They were standing at the edge of one, same as the rest of us, looking down into water too deep to see the bottom of. Some people do not need proof. They saw the copper face with their own eyes, and that was enough. They do not raise their voice when they talk about it. They just tell you what they know, calm and steady, the way you tell someone the sun rose that morning. A woman in Oklahoma kept one such face, wrapped in cloth, inside a cedar box for 40 years. Her grandmother gave it to her, and her grandmother's mother gave it to her before that. She never sold it. She never let a museum photograph it. When people asked where it came from, she said only one word: Etowah. She did not explain further, and nobody who knew her pushed for more. A retired school teacher in Georgia, not far from the mound sites, spent 30 summers walking creek beds after heavy rain. He was looking for nothing in particular, he'd tell you, just walking. But 3 times in his life, the water pulled back a curtain of mud and showed him copper. Small pieces, a curved edge here, a fragment of a hollow eye there. He turned every piece over to the state. He kept nothing for himself. When a reporter once asked him why he gave it all away, he said the copper never belonged to him in the first place, and he was not about to start pretending it did. These people did not agree on what the faces meant. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The woman in Oklahoma believed the face in her cedar box was a guardian, something meant to watch over her family, the way it once watched over a grave. The school teacher in Georgia believed the copper was simply memory, a piece of ground that had not finished telling its story. Neither one needed the other to be right. Both of them were certain. Picture what it costs a person to say a thing like that out loud, in a town where most folks would rather talk about the weather. You would feel the weight of every raised eyebrow. You would feel your neighbors go quiet when you walked into the feed store, the way a room goes quiet when someone mentions a name nobody wants to say twice. And still, some people kept talking. They talked because staying silent felt heavier than being doubted. There is a farmer's widow near Cartersville who still tells the story of her husband's discovery, decades after he passed. She was young when he found the fragment, a thin curl of copper, no bigger than a playing card, turned up behind the plow. One spring morning, he carried it inside, on his palm like a man carrying a bird with a broken wing. He never sold it, never let it leave the house. She keeps it now in the same drawer he kept it in, wrapped in the same soft flannel. She will show it to you if you ask kindly. She will not tell you what it means. She only says that some things are not hers to explain, only hers to protect. Archaeologists who worked the mounds in the early days carried their own quiet convictions too, the kind they rarely put in official reports. One dig supervisor in the 1930s wrote in a private letter, not a published paper, that standing over an opened burial chamber felt like standing in a room where someone had just left. He used those exact words. Someone had just left. None of these witnesses were paid. None of them wrote books or gave lectures. They simply lived their lives with the weight of what they had seen, and when someone finally asked, they answered plainly. That plainness is its own kind of evidence, even if it will never hold up in a courtroom or a peer review. A person with nothing to gain rarely bothers to invent a mystery. If you sat across the table from any of them, you would not hear excitement in their voice. You would hear something closer to grief, mixed with respect. the tone people use when they speak about the dead. They are not trying to convince you of anything. They already know what they know. The believing was never the hard part for them. The hard part was deciding, after years of silence, that the copper faces deserved to be spoken of at all, even if no one could say exactly what they were. The copper did not come from Georgia. That is the first fact you have to sit with. Out here on the floodplain where the Etowah River bends like a slow brown snake, copper is not native to this red clay ground. It came from somewhere far off, carried by hands that walked hundreds of miles, and nobody rode down the road they walked. Most of the raw copper found in these mounds traces back to the Great Lakes, up near what is now Michigan. Some traces further, to the southern Appalachians, to seams of ore buried deep in mountain rock. Either way, the distance is enormous. You are talking about a journey on foot, through forest and river and swamp, carrying heavy stone-cold metal the whole way, with no wheel, no horse, no compass but the sun and stars. Picture that walk for a moment. Picture a line of men moving through hardwood forest, thick with fog, copper wrapped in hide and slung across their backs, moving toward a town they may never have seen before. That is the picture archaeologists have built from the copper alone. No road survives, no worn path, no markers in stone saying which way to go. And yet, the copper got here, over and over, for generations. This is the trade route nobody can fully explain. Not because there is no evidence of trade. There is plenty. Shell from the Gulf Coast turns up at Etowah. Mica from the Carolina Mountains turns up here too. Stone tools carry the fingerprint of quarries hundreds of miles distant. The problem is not proving trade happened. The problem is explaining how it worked, who controlled it, and why copper mattered enough to justify the war. Some researchers believe the copper moved through a chain of chiefdoms, town to town, gift to gift, until it reached the hands that hammered it into faces. Under this theory, no single group made the whole journey. Instead, the metal passed from one river valley to the next, changing hands like a slow relay race across the southeast. If that is true, the copper itself became a kind of message, carried farther than any voice could travel, marking alliances that left no other trace behind. Other researchers push back on that picture. They point to how consistent the copper working is, town to town, style to style. The faces at Etowah share a visual grammar with copper plates found in Oklahoma, in Illinois, in Wisconsin. That kind of consistency, they argue, suggests something tighter than casual handoffs between neighbors. It suggests specialists who traveled themselves, who trained under the same masters, who carried more than metal when they moved between towns. Knowledge moved with the copper, not just the raw material. You do not need the argument settled to feel the weight of the distance. Somebody walked that copper here. Somebody decided it was worth walking for. That decision, repeated across centuries, built the mound you would stand on today if you climbed to the top of Etowah in the early morning light. The grass silver with dew, the river fog rising off the water like breath from a sleeping animal. Stand there long enough, and the land starts to feel like it is keeping something back. Farmers near the site talk about ground that will not hold a foundation, ground that shifts and settles in ways their neighbor's land does not. Surveyors have noted odd drainage patterns near the mounds, water pooling where it should not pool, refusing to run off the way gravity says it should. None of this proves anything on its own. Rivers move, clay shifts, but people who work this land for a living notice when a field behaves differently than the field beside it. Year after year, without explanation, older residents near the river tell of deer that will not cross a certain stretch of bottomland near the mounds, cutting wide around it, even when easier paths exist. Whether that is memory or coincidence, nobody can say for certain. Animals do not leave testimony. But if you had stood on that bank at dusk, watching deer break their path rather than cross open ground, you might have felt what the old-timers felt. Not fear exactly, something closer to respect, the kind you give a place that seems to remember more than it should. The mystery of the trade route and the mystery of the land itself break together here. Both point outward, past the mound, into distances too large and too old to map completely. The copper walked hundreds of miles to become a face. The ground beneath that face still behaves like it knows something the rest of the valley does not. Nobody has explained either fact fully. Nobody may ever get the chance. All that remains is the walking distance, the strange ground, and the quiet certainty that both were shaped by hands and decisions long since gone silent. You could set the copper faces down in a locked case, under climate control, behind glass thick as a fist, and still lose them. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but it happened. Not once, but again and again, in museums scattered across this country, in ways nobody has ever fully explained. Picture a museum basement in the 1930s. Wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, each one holding pieces pulled from southeastern mounds. Etowah faces, Spiro shellwork, copper plates, wrapped in newspaper and cotton batting, tagged with faded ink that nobody bothered to read twice. The men who packed those crates were in a hurry. They had more digging to do, more land to clear, and cataloguing felt like a chore for later. Later never came the way anyone expected. Records burned in a fire at one institution. A flood took the basement of another. A curator retired, and the man who replaced him could not find half of what the ledger said should be there. If you have ever misplaced a single photograph and felt that small ache of loss, imagine misplacing an entire civilization's only voice. That is the weight sitting on some of these collections. The Smithsonian itself lost track of pieces for decades. Some copper plates from southeastern mounds sat unlabeled in storage, mixed in with other finds, their origins scrambled by paperwork nobody double-checked. Researchers in the later 20th century had to go looking, digging through old accession numbers like detectives working a cold case. Some faces got found again. Some are still missing, and nobody knows if they were stolen, misfiled, or simply thrown away by someone who did not understand what they were holding. This is not just an Etowah problem. It happened at Spiro in Oklahoma, where looters and diggers moved so fast in the 1930s that thousands of artifacts left the ground with no record of where they came from or what lay beside them. Shell engravings, copper repousse work, woven fabric almost 2,000 years old, all of it scattered to private collectors, pawn shops and roadside stands. Before any scholar could stop it, pieces from that one site turned up decades later in estate sales in states that had nothing to do with the original dig. The same story plays out at Moundville in Alabama, at Cahokia in Illinois, at smaller sites across Georgia and Tennessee, whose names never made it into any textbook. Early excavators, working before modern archaeology had rules, often kept sloppy notes, or none at all. They wanted the shiny object, not the layer of soil it came from. And soil, to an archaeologist, is half the story. Without it, an object becomes a mystery wrapped in another mystery. Some folks who study this pattern point to simple human failure, rushed digs, underfunded museums, a country still deciding whether its own ancient past deserved careful hands. That explanation is dry, practical, and probably true more often than not. A crate falls behind a shelf, a label rots. A well-meaning volunteer throws out what looks like scrap metal because nobody told her otherwise. History gets lost the same way anything gets lost, through neglect rather than mystery. But others are not so sure. That explains everything. They point to how often these losses cluster around southeastern copperwork specifically, faces and plates tied to the same silent chiefdom, as if the objects themselves resist being catalogued and kept. Skeptics call that superstition dressed up as pattern recognition. Believers ask why so many separate institutions, decades and states apart, tell nearly the same story about the same category of object slipping through their fingers. If you walked into one of those old museum basements today, you would smell dust and old paper and something like cold stone. Rows of shelving would stretch back further than the light reaches. Somewhere on one of those shelves, a face of hammered copper might be sitting in a box, marked with the wrong number, waiting for someone to open it and ask the right question. That waiting has already lasted the better part of a century for some of these pieces. What survived tells us a little. What went missing tells us that we have never fully controlled this story, not even in the buildings built to protect it. The chiefdom lost its own name centuries ago. Now, in a strange echo, some of its last physical words have gotten lost twice more. First in the ground, then again on a shelf built by the very people trying to save them. If the copper faces are the only language left from that world, then somewhere in America right now, a sentence of that language sits unread, mislabeled and forgotten, waiting for the next person, patient enough to go looking. Follow the copper north, away from Etowah, and you find something strange. The same faces show up along the Ohio Valley, hundreds of miles from Georgia clay. Not copies, not knockoffs made by a lesser hand. The same eyes, the same open mouth, the same forked design under the socket, turning up in mounds that belong to different people, in different centuries, speaking languages the Etowah dead never knew. You can hold this fact in your hand the way you'd hold a stone. It does not soften with time. A face found near the Scioto River carries the same weeping motif as a face lifted from a burial in Georgia. The metal came from different mines. The hands that hammered them were separated by generations, and yet the design travels between them like a word passed mouth to mouth, unchanged, as if someone somewhere agreed on what a certain image must always mean. Think about what that takes. No books moved along that river, no maps, no couriers with sealed orders, no trade agreements written on parchment, just people, walking or paddling for weeks, carrying goods and stories and symbols, the way you might carry water in a skin, careful not to spill a drop of what you know. A face made in one river valley crosses into another and comes out looking almost exactly the same. That is not accident. That is memory, moving on foot. The Ohio Valley Mounds give up their own copper, and it tells its own quiet story. Some pieces come out shaped into hands, oversized, fingers spread wide, palms empty. Archaeologists call them the mica hands and copper hands, found near Hopewell sites built centuries before Etowah rose. Nobody knows if these mark the same tradition or an older cousin to it, but the posture is the same silence. No maker's mark, no name pressed into the metal, no line of writing scratched along the edge to say who did this or why. Picture a woman in 1891 sifting through spoil from a mound near Chillicothe. Her hands raw from the cold, breath fogging in front of her face. She lifts a copper hand from the dirt and turns it over, looking for a signature that isn't there. She finds nothing, just the shape, patient and finished, waiting the way it had waited for 1,000 years before she arrived. If you had knelt in that frozen dirt beside her, the metal would have felt the same in your palm, cool and certain, and just as unwilling to explain itself. Letters from early collectors mention this same frustration again and again, like a low hum running under the excitement of discovery. One collector writes to a colleague about a copper plate pulled from a mound in Illinois, describing the raptor motif stamped into its face, the same curved beak and spread wing found at Etowah, nearly 1,000 miles east. He calls it, in his own words, a puzzle with pieces that fit, but no picture on the box. He never solves it. Nobody after him solves it either. Photographs from later digs add their own quiet evidence. Black and white plates from the 1930s show copper pieces laid out on cloth, numbered, catalogued, and next to them, smaller fragments too corroded to identify, shapes that might have been faces once and are now just green ghosts of themselves. Look closely at some of these old photographs, and you'll notice something in the background, propped against a shovel or half wrapped in newspaper. A second face, uncatalogued, that never makes it into the official records. Where it went afterward, nobody has ever fully traced. Some researchers argue this spread proves a single widespread religion, a belief system stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, using copper as its shared scripture. Others push back hard against that idea. They argue that separate peoples could have arrived at similar images independently, the way separate cultures across the world all eventually draw a spiral or a sunburst without ever meeting. Both sides agree on one thing only: the copper survived and the explanation did not. That gap between the object and its meaning is the real inheritance here. You can hold the metal. You can trace the hammered lines with your thumb, feel where the hand pressed harder, where it eased off. But the thought behind the design stayed inside a head that stopped breathing centuries ago, and it never found its way onto paper, onto stone, onto anything that outlasted skin and bone. The Ohio Valley just adds more whispers to a room that was already full of them, more faces asking to be understood, none of them answering back. There is a family in Cartersville, Georgia, that still talks about a grave, not the mound itself, not the museum case where the copper faces sit under glass, a different grave on a hillside outside town, where their great-grandfather worked for 3 summers as a young man on the early digs at Etowah. His name was Wade, or at least that is the name the family remembers. He was hired for pay he badly needed, to haul dirt and sift clay, with a hand trowel under a supervisor from a university up north. The story says he was careful and quiet and good with his hands, which is maybe why he was the one who found the second face, not the famous one. A smaller one, tucked under a collapsed shoulder bone, green as pond water and cool as a coin left out in October. He was told, like everyone on that crew, to log it, wrap it, and hand it up the chain. That much matches the record. What happens after that depends entirely on which cousin is telling the story at the table. One version says Wade took nothing. He followed every instruction, filled out his card, and went home that night to a wife who noticed he did not eat much dinner. He told her the face had looked at him, not glared, not threatened, just looked the way a person looks at you when they are trying to remember your name. He said he felt watched the rest of that week, out in the fields, in church, lying in bed at night. Then it passed, and he never spoke of the mound again after that season ended. The other version, the one told a little lower and a little later, at the table, says Wade kept something, not the face, never the face. A scrap of the copper foil that flaked off during cleaning, thin as a fingernail paring, small enough to slip into a shirt pocket without anyone counting it. He kept it in a tin box his whole life. His daughter found it after he died and did not know what it was. She only knew her father had never wanted anyone to touch that particular box while he was living. You can hear both versions and understand why families keep both. One protects Wade as an honest man doing honest work in a hard decade. The other explains why he changed according to his daughter in the years after Etowah. Quieter, slower to laugh, a man who kept a lantern burning some nights for no reason he would give. None of this proves anything, and no responsible person tracing this story pretends otherwise. There is no photograph of the tin box. There is no chain of custody, no museum accession number, nothing you could set beside the real Etowah faces and compare. What exists is a family's memory of a man's mood, stretched across 3 generations of holiday dinners, softened here, sharpened there, the way any story is handled by hands that love the person at its center. But the family is not alone in shape, if not in detail. Talk to enough people around river towns, from Georgia to Tennessee to Alabama, and you find small private versions of the same tale. A relative who worked a dig, a relative who kept something small they should not have, a change in that relative. Afterward, never dramatic, always described the same careful way. Quieter, more watchful, done talking about it long before they died. The objects differ, the rivers differ. The shape of the story does not. Folklorists, who study grave-robbing legends across the southeast, will tell you this pattern shows up around burial sites belonging to cultures with no descendants left to explain, defend, or forgive what happened to their dead. The story becomes a way for the living to sit with the discomfort they cannot name outright. Something was taken from people who cannot ask for it back. The guilt has to go somewhere, so it goes into a story about a lantern burning at night, for no reason anyone can give. A skeptic would put it plainer still. Grief and worry make private meaning out of nothing. A man who worked a hard, low-paying job during hard, low-paying years might have simply been tired, worried about money, aging the way everyone ages. No copper face required. Still, Wade's daughter kept the tin box until the day she died and passed it to nobody, because by then she said she did not want it in the house anymore either. If you had sat at that table and heard the story firsthand, you would have watched the room go quiet in the exact same place every time, right after the part about the lantern, right before anyone reached for the coffee pot again. Set the arguments down for a moment. Set aside the men who say the copper faces are proof of a lost tribe of giants, and the men who say they are nothing but trade goods, hammered thin and sold like beads. Both sides have shouted for 100 years. Underneath all that shouting, something quieter waits. Something that does not need to be proven, because it never asks to be believed. It only asks to be noticed. Here is the plain truth, the one that needs no argument at all. People stood on that mound at Etowah and buried someone they loved. They wrapped a body in cloth, woven by hand, thread by thread, over the slow hours of a winter night. They laid copper faces over that body like a blanket laid over a sleeping child. They did this because it mattered to them, the same way a funeral matters to you now, the same way you would choose the flowers, the words, the quiet, if it was someone you loved lying still. You do not need to know the name of the chief to feel the weight of that grief. You do not need to translate the language to understand that someone knelt in that dirt and wept. The copper does not care whether we call it art or armor, ritual or rank. It only knows it was placed there by hands that trembled, or hands that moved with practiced calm. Hands that had done this work of mourning before, and would do it again. Picture the village on the morning after a burial like that. Smoke rises thin and grey from cooking fires along the river flat. Children run between houses shaped like beehives, their voices bright against the heavy quiet of the adults. Somewhere a drum sounds once, then stops, as if even the drum knows to leave space for grief. The mound stands taller now than it did the day before, packed fresh with new earth, the color of a wound not yet healed. This was a real morning, real light. Fell across real water. Real people walked here with real feet, and they carried real sorrow in their chests, sorrow that did not care what century it was in. That is the part historians sometimes forget to say out loud. Etowah was not a puzzle waiting 500 years to be solved by us. It was a home. It was a place where somebody's grandmother told stories by firelight, where somebody's child learned to fish in that river before the light was gone, where the smell of corn roasting drifted over the plaza on a summer evening thick as syrup. The copper faces are not the whole story. They are only what survived the story. The way a single photograph survives a house fire, its edges burned, its center somehow still clear. Think about what that means for you, sitting wherever you are sitting now, warm and safe, listening to a voice tell you about people who have been gone 5 centuries somewhere. Someday, someone might dig up a single object from your own life. A ring, a key, a photograph with your face half turned from the camera. They will not know your name. They will not know who you loved, or what you feared, or what song you hummed when you thought no one could hear. They will only know that something mattered enough to be kept, and that will have to be enough. That is the same thin thread connecting us to Etowah now. The mystery does not disappear just because we step back from it. The faces still have no names. The chiefdom still left no voice we can hear in our own tongue. But maybe the mystery was never really about who they were in some list of facts. Maybe it was always about the fact that they were here at all, breathing, working, grieving, loving the same as us, under a sky that looked almost the same as the one over your head tonight. The copper does not tarnish, and maybe that is the real message hidden in the metal. Not a code, not a warning, just a plain, patient refusal to be forgotten. It sat in the dark of that mound for 500 years, waiting without impatience, the way a river waits for rain. It did not need us to solve it. It only needed us eventually to come close enough to look. And once you have looked, once you have held that copper face in your mind, and felt its hollow eyes settle on you in the dark, you already carry a piece of that village home with you, whether you understand it or not. You have already answered the only question that ever really mattered here. Someone lived. Someone was loved. Someone did not want them forgotten. His name was Warren King Moorhead, and by the winter of 1925, he had already spent 3 seasons at Etowah. He had already lifted the copper faces from the clay with his own 2 hands. He had already shipped them north, catalogued them, written about them in careful, measured prose. And still, something about that mound would not let him rest. Picture him now. Picture the mounds themselves, out past the tree line, black shapes against a sky gone the color of a bruise. No electric light for miles, no hum of anything man-made, just the wind moving low through the dead grass, and the Etowah River somewhere behind it all, running the way it has always run, patient and dark and unbothered by the men who dig at its banks. You are standing where he stood. Feel the cold coming up through the ground, through your boots, into your bones. The air smells like wet clay and wood smoke from some farmhouse chimney a half-mile off. Above you, the stars are so thick they look like salt thrown across a black table. more of them than any city dweller ever sees. And somewhere in that scatter of light, if you looked long enough, you might believe an old sky god was looking back down at you. Moorhead kept a journal. Later biographers and fellow diggers would say he grew restless in those final Etowah seasons, that sleep came harder each year he spent near that mound. He never wrote that the ground spoke to him. He never claimed a ghost sat on the edge of his cot. What he wrote, in the plain, dry language of a working scientist, was that he could not stop turning the faces over in his mind long after the lanterns were out. Think about what that means. A man trained to measure and catalogue. A man who spent his life sorting bones and beads into careful boxes, lying awake because of 2 sheets of hammered copper, not because they frightened him, because they refused to answer him. The wind picks up now, the way it does on a river bottom at night, and it drags a low sound through the grass that could be nothing at all, or could be the mound settling the way old earth settles, shifting its weight the way a sleeper turns over. Stand there long enough and the dark stops feeling empty. It starts feeling occupied, the way a house feels occupied even when every room is quiet. Moorhead was not the only one who felt it. Diggers on other southeastern sites, decades before and decades after him, wrote about the same strange fatigue that settled over a crew working a mound at night, heaviness in the limbs that had nothing to do with the shovel work. Some blamed the river damp. Some blamed exhaustion, the kind that comes from weeks of careful, slow labor under a Georgia sun. A few, off the record, over coffee, admitted they simply did not like being alone with the faces after dark. That is the version most comfortable to believe. The tired scientist, the damp night air, a mind that will not switch off after a long day. It costs nothing to accept. It asks nothing impossible of you. But there is another version, the one that gets passed quietly between people who have spent real time at Etowah, diggers and caretakers, and a few old-timers from the river towns nearby. They say the mound was built to hold something, and holding is not the same as forgetting. They say a resting place for a chief is still, in some old and patient way, occupied. Stand on the mound past midnight, they say, and you are not standing on empty ground, you are standing on a roof. You do not have to choose between these 2 stories tonight. You can hold them both, the way Moorhead may have held them both, turning them over in the dark, the same way he turned over the copper in his hands. A man can respect the science and still feel small under an old sky. A man can trust his instruments and still lie awake, listening to a wind that sounds, for just a moment, like it is saying something in a language nobody living can translate. If you had stood there with him on that cold rise above the river, you would have felt the same thing pulling at you. Not fear, something quieter, a sense that the ground remembered more than the books ever would, and that no measurement, no careful drawing, no catalogue number would ever be enough to settle the question those faces raised the moment they came up out of the clay. The stars would have gone on turning overhead, indifferent and beautiful, the way they always have over that river valley, and you would have understood, the way Moorhead seemed to understand, that some silences are not empty. They are only waiting for someone patient enough to sit inside them until morning. Think about what it means to guard something. A guard stands between 2 things. On one side sits the thing worth keeping. On the other side sits whatever might come to take it. The copper faces of Etowah have always been called guardians, and maybe that word carries more truth than anyone first intended. Picture the mound itself, tall as a 2-story house, rising out of the Georgia bottomland like a green shoulder pushed up from the earth. For 800 years it has stood watch over a bend in the Etowah River. The people who built it are gone. The language they spoke is gone. But the shape of that mound remains, patient and unmoved. The way a held breath remains until someone finally lets it out. The faces were buried with the dead, and burial itself is a kind of guarding. You do not bury a stranger's belongings by accident. You choose what goes into the ground with a person, and in that choosing, you say something about what mattered. Copper does not rot. It does not rust the way iron does. A copper face placed over a dead man's chest could outlast his body, his descendants, his entire town. Maybe the makers understood that. Maybe they wanted something of the dead to remain past forgetting, even if the name attached to it did not survive. There is a theory, favored by some archaeologists working the southeast today, that these plates were never meant for the living at all. They were made for the dead to carry into whatever came next, a face for the afterlife, a mask to be recognized by, worn not for other people, but for gods or ancestors waiting on the other side. If that is true, then you are not looking at art. You are looking at a passport, a ticket punched once, meant to be used by only one traveler, meant to never be seen by human eyes again once the mound closed over it. Other researchers push back against that idea. They point to where patterns. Under this view, the faces guarded the living first. They were regalia for chiefs during ceremonies, worn to show that a bloodline held power granted by the sky, the sun, the thunder. Only later, when the wearer died, did the object pass into the ground to keep guarding him there. Two theories, two very different Etowahs, and both fit the same scraps of copper equally well. What nobody disputes is the effect these objects have had on the people who came after. Cartersville, Georgia, grew up practically leaning against that mound, and the town has never quite been able to look away from it. Local festivals now build themselves around native heritage and the mystery of the Mississippian world. School children walk the grounds on field trips and stand where warriors once stood, copper glinting on their chests, under a sun that has not changed in 8 centuries. If you grew up near that river, the mound was not a ruin. It was a neighbor, a quiet, older neighbor who never explained himself, but never had to be feared either. Archaeologists who have spent careers on this site describe something similar to what religious pilgrims describe: a settling, a hush that falls over you near the mound that has nothing to do with wind or weather. Some call it professional habit, the mind slowing down out of respect for old ground. Others admit, quietly, off the record, that it feels like being watched by something patient and without malice. The faces might explain that feeling, or the feeling might simply be what old places do to people who stand still long enough inside them. There is a way of looking at the world that grows up around a place like this, a way you notice only if you spend real time there. People who live near the Etowah Mounds tend to speak about the past differently than people elsewhere, less as something finished, more as something folded close, still warm, still capable of surprising you. The dig site does not feel like a museum exhibit. It feels like a room where someone stepped out and might come back. If you stood at the base of that mound at dusk, with the copper faces resting behind museum glass, just up the hill, you would feel the weight of 8 centuries settle onto your shoulders, like a coat you did not ask to wear. You would understand, without being told, that guarding does not always mean protecting from harm. Sometimes it means holding a shape steady long enough for someone, someday, to notice it was never really lost at all. Nobody knows the name of the last person to walk out of Etowah. That is the truth you have to sit with, but the story survived anyway, and it survived because somebody carried it. That is how legends move, not through books. through people who pack up their lives and take the old words with them, even when the words no longer have a home to return to. Picture a woman in the 1700s. She is Cherokee, or maybe Muskogee, living in a town built near the old mounds, but not of them. The mounds are already ancient to her. Grass has grown thick over the temple platforms. Trees stand where the copper workers once bent low over their fires. She has heard, since she was a child, that her people are not the ones who raised those earthworks. Something older came first. Something with no name she was ever taught. She hears it from her grandmother, sitting by a low fire on a cold night, smoke curling up through a smoke hole in the roof. The old woman tells her that faces made of red metal once watched over the dead in that ground. She says the faces had no mouths. She says the people who made them are gone now, scattered like ash on wind, and nobody living remembers where they went. That is the whole story. No ending, no answer. Just an old woman passing a mystery to a young one, the way you might pass down a ring, with no note explaining who wore it first. Decades pass. Wars come, the removal comes, and thousands of Cherokee families are pushed off this land at gunpoint and marched west through mud and fever and grief, on a road you now call the Trail of Tears. If you had walked that road yourself, cold rains soaking through your coat, you would have carried only what fit in your arms. Most families could not carry a single object more than the food and blankets that kept their children alive. But some things travel without weight. Stories travel light. The woman, or her daughter, or her daughter's daughter, carries the memory of copper faces all the way to Oklahoma, folded into a story about ancestors nobody could name. That is the wanderer's gift. She does not carry proof. She carries the shape of a mystery, and she hands it forward, generation to generation, the way a river hands water downstream, without ever keeping any of it for itself. In Oklahoma, the story changes shape, the way stories always do when they land in new soil. Maybe the faces are said to belong to giants now. Maybe they become guardians of a lost city under the water, or messengers sent by the sun. The details shift, loosen, grow new edges. But one thing stays fixed at the center, unmoved through every retelling. There were people here before, and they left something behind made of metal that would not rust, and nobody left to explain what it meant. You could call this the softest kind of evidence there is. It will not hold up in a lab. No archaeologist can carbon date a memory passed between grandmothers. But listen to how many separate families, scattered across separate states, tell some version of the same fragment. A shining metal face, a mound that held it, a people who disappeared before anyone could write their history down. That kind of repetition does not prove a fact. It proves that something true enough and strange enough refused to be forgotten, even after the world tried to erase the people who remembered it. Skeptics will tell you oral memory drifts too far over centuries to trust completely. A story passed through 10 generations is not the same story it started as, they say, and they are not wrong. Names get swapped. Timelines fold in on themselves. What one grandmother called a face might have been a shield, or a gorget, or nothing more than firelight glinting on a lake at dusk. Memory bends, the way copper bends, softly, under enough pressure and enough time. But others push back on that doubt. They ask why so many unrelated families, removed to different territories, separated by hundreds of miles and different tribal histories, kept circling back to the same central image, a face with no mouth, a metal that outlives its makers. If it were only drift, they argue, the stories should have scattered into 100 unrecognizable shapes by now. Instead, they still rhyme with each other, faint but unmistakable, like an old song half remembered by strangers who never learned it from the same singer. The wanderer never got to hold a copper face herself. She only held the story of one, passed hand to hand like a warm coal wrapped in cloth, carried across 1,000 miles of grief and distance, and somehow, against every reason it should have gone cold, it did not. The last face did not stay together. That is the part few people know when they first hear this story. The copper plate that came out of that Etowah mound in pieces went back into the ground of history the same way, scattered, divided, sent to places its makers never could have named. Some pieces went to a museum in Washington, sealed behind glass under soft yellow light. Some went to a university drawer in the Midwest, wrapped in cotton, pulled out only twice a year for students who barely glance at it. One fragment, the story goes, sat in a private collection for decades, passed from one collector to another, its provenance thinning out with each sale, like a river losing water to dry ground. Nobody agreed to split it up on purpose. It simply happened, the way most American history happens, in pieces, through hands that did not know what they were holding. If you tried to see the whole face today, you would need 3 plane tickets and a lot of letters written to museum curators. You would need patience most people do not have. And even then, you would only be looking at copper. You would not be looking at the hands that shaped it, or the fire that warmed it soft enough to bend, or the eyes that once looked out at a village full of people whose names went into the ground with them. Some of the old collectors believed they were saving these things. That is worth remembering. Even now, the 19th century had a hunger for artifacts, a belief that anything old and strange belonged in a glass case where educated men could study it. Nobody asked the Mounds for permission. Nobody thought to ask what the copper faces might have meant to the people still living nearby, descendants of the towns that once ringed these rivers, who watched strangers dig up their neighbors and carry them away in wooden crates. That is the quiet shame folded into this whole story. The faces survived. The people who understood them were pushed out, moved off, silenced by centuries of displacement, long before any archaeologist ever picked up a shovel. So, when we ask what the copper faces mean, we are asking a question that history made almost impossible to answer. The people who might have known are gone, or scattered, or holding pieces of knowledge too broken to reassemble, the same way the copper itself sits broken in drawers, 3 states apart. A few tribal historians today, working with archaeologists who finally learned to ask rather than take, believe some answers survive in ceremony, in dance, in patterns stitched into old regalia that echo the copper's swirls and feathered men. They say the language never fully died. It changed shape the way a river changes shape without stopping being a river. Other scholars are less certain, worried that connecting scattered fragments into a tidy story does a different kind of violence to a past too fragmented to speak for itself. Both things might be true at once. That is the strange comfort in a mystery like this one. It does not have to resolve into a single answer to still matter. If you held that copper face today, whole or in pieces, you would feel something heavier than metal in your palm. You would feel the weight of 500 years of silence pressed into a shape no larger than a dinner plate. You would feel the fire that once softened it, the hands that hammered it thin, the eyes of a man in a mound who wore it once and never explained why. You would feel all of that, and you would still not know his name. Somewhere tonight, in a climate-controlled room, in a museum most visitors walk past without stopping, one of those faces sits in the dark behind glass. The hallway lights click off one by one at closing time. A guard's boots echo once down the marble floor, then fade. The building settles into silence, the kind that has nothing to do with hauntings and everything to do with time moving on without asking permission. And the face waits there, hollow-eyed, patient, exactly the way it waited under 6 feet of Georgia clay for 1,000 years. It has outlasted the chiefdom that made it. It has outlasted every language that could have named it. It may outlast every person now living who wonders about it, including you and me. The last question is the simplest one, and the one nobody can answer. Did the Maker know, hammering that copper thin under firelight centuries ago, that his work would outlive everything else his people ever built, that the villages would empty, the language would fade, the mounds would go quiet, and this one small, stubborn face would still be looking back at strangers long after every story about it had turned to guesswork? Think about a copper face resting in a glass case tonight. The room around it is dark. The building is locked. Somewhere, a guard walks a quiet hallway, and his footsteps are the only sound for miles of hushed hallways and sleeping history. The face does not know it is famous. It never asked to be found, and it never asked to be understood. That is the strange shape of this whole story. We started at a plow, catching on something hard in Georgia clay. We end here, still turning the same question over like a stone in our hand. Who made this? Who wore this? Who buried this? And why? 4 words and centuries of silence sitting behind every one of them. The people of Etowah did not leave us letters. They left us posture. They left us the tilt of a chin, the spread of a wing, the shape of an eye that was never meant to blink. A shell gorget speaks in spirals. A copper plate speaks in stillness. Put them side by side across 1,000 miles of the southeast, and you start to hear something like a sentence, even if you will never know the words in it. Some folks will tell you that is enough. They will say the pattern itself is the message, that a shared symbol stretched from the Tennessee hills to the Mississippi Delta is proof of a world once stitched together by belief, trade, and story. Others will tell you we are only seeing what we want to see, that human eyes find faces in clouds and meaning in coincidence. Both of those people have stood in front of the same case, in the same museum, and both of them left with a different feeling in their chest. That is the real inheritance of Etowah. Not an answer, a feeling. The mound still rises out of the Georgia ground, the way it did when the first plow struck copper, green and heavy with grass, patient under an open sky. Visitors walk its slope in the late afternoon, and their shadows stretch long behind them, the same way a chief's shadow might have stretched centuries before. The river still moves past the old town site, slow and brown, carrying nothing but water and reflected light. It carried canoes once. It carries kayaks now. It has never once explained itself. If you stood